is Landon Gilfillan with Pepper and Pine Garden Design, and today I want to show you the progress my tomato plants have made since practically being wiped out by a cold snap over Memorial Day weekend. I'm also going to be sharing some tomato pruning tips as well as some transplanting tips. So over Memorial Day weekend, we had a crazy cold snap that happened here in Southwest Michigan, and I know a lot of gardeners and farmers were affected by that, and my garden definitely was. I ended up losing a large amount of my tomato plants. I had planted 70 plants, and most of them looked like this, which was really, really devastating to walk out to the next morning. And I kind of went back and forth on whether or not to pull all of them out, to let some of them stay and see if they would recover. And so I did both. Some of them I knew were gone. I pulled them out. I was probably left with about 10 tomato plants of my original, 10 to 15. I still haven't done a count. And then I ended up buying some tomato plants from a local farmer and actually starting from seed the very beginning of June. So what I want to show you today is how the plants that I left in the ground have recovered. Now again, I'm going to show you the before and then I'll show you the afterward, and it's actually quite remarkable how well these plants snapped back from that cold snap. And honestly, they are the biggest plants in the garden, which tells a lot about a plant's determination to like pull through and survive. I'm actually quite shocked that they look as good as they do, but you know, you just never know what's going to happen in the garden. And then I also want to show you, I haven't pruned these plants. I didn't want to stress them out anymore. Normally when I put plants in the ground, I start pruning them from like day one and just kind of keep pruning them as they grow, and I really haven't done that. So this will be a perfect example to show you some tomato pruning tips, show you some tomato pruning tips and how they can help you get the kind of tomatoes and the tomato plant you want this year. Then I also want to show you the tomatoes I started from seed and how they're looking, because I believe I'm going to plant them in the ground today. So welcome to my tomato show. We're going to be all about tomatoes today. Okay, so here is the picture of what the tomatoes look like when I found them the next morning after the cold snap. They were definitely affected, very similar to frost damage is what I was seeing, you know, brown leaves, limp, stems folded over, the whole thing, it just looked awful. It was very devastating. So let me show you where these plants are right now. So this is the madness that's that I'm looking at from these plants that recovered. They're so full. They've got tons of branching in here. I've really kind of let these go. So it's been really interesting to see, you know, kind of how they grow when they're not being pruned on a regular basis, when they're just kind of left to do their own thing. A lot of these plants lost their main stem, and so a lot of this growth you're seeing is from the suckers that developed off that main branch. I mean, it's really kind of hard to tell at this point what's the main branch and what are the suckers. So I'll get in there and show you some of that here in a second. Here's another plant that recovered. I'm starting to see fruit develop here, and you can just kind of see all the different branches that are going on inside this plant. This is definitely the main stem right here. And so that's where I'll be doing the majority of my pruning. But I am going to have to be careful, because you don't want to prune more than 30% of a plant at a time. You need to give it time to recover. You really should do a good watering before or afterwards, preferably before, to make sure that it can handle the stress of the pruning. So this is going to be a slower process than what I'm used to, but I'm just glad that these plants have, you know, come back with fervor and look so healthy. Generally, when I prune a tomato plant, I'm really pruning down to one main stem, and I prune off most of the suckers. Now, there's different theories as to whether you should prune suckers or not, so you can kind of find which camp you land in. I kind of go half and half. So for my plants that I really want the big fruits, those are the plants that I'm going to prune a lot of suckers off of, because I really want that plant putting its energy into those bigger fruits. My gold medal tomatoes, my German pink tomatoes, my Paul Robesons, my big boy that I've got growing over here, and my Beefmaster, I will probably be pruning the majority of the suckers off those plants so that I get bigger fruit, okay? Now, if you want more fruit and you're not so concerned about the size of the fruit, then you can leave the suckers to kind of do their thing. the more suckers you have on your plant, the more fruit you're going to have on your plant, because those suckers will produce more branches and more flowers and therefore more fruit. Now, my only caveat to that, and this behind me is kind of a perfect example of it, the more suckers you have, the more crazy your plant is going to be, the harder it's going to be to maintain, the harder it's going to be for, air to get in here, and there to get aeration between the leaves, and that can lead to a higher percentage or a higher likeliness of blight. So blight happens when there's a lot of moisture in the air and heat, and it's kind of like a mildew fungus that grows on the leaves. So really, to help prevent that, you want to make sure your tomato plants are spaced appropriately so that they're getting air between each plant, and really help pruning a lot of those suckers and branches off the plant can really help to provide that airflow in your plant and between the plants. So if you've ever grown a tomato plant in a tomato cage that's too small, you know what I'm talking about. It's really hard to get in there sometimes and find the fruit. It just feels almost out of control, and I'm not really a fan of that. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to prune these tomato plants today, keeping in mind that I don't want to take off more than 30%, and also keeping in mind what I'm wanting these plants to produce. Am I wanting more fruit from them, or am I wanting bigger fruit? So let me just get right into that, and then I'll show you these seedlings that I started from seed June 1st in my house. So, and they look great. And it's really just a testament to the time that you have to grow things even just in one season. You don't have to start everything indoors. Some things you definitely want to, but you could actually get away with even starting a tomato plant later in the season than maybe what you're generally told to do. Okay, so let me show you pruning. First and foremost, make sure you have clean shears. If you've used your shears or your snippers to cut plants that have any sort of disease on them, you want to be careful not to spread that to another plant. So just, wipe them down with alcohol. That's the best thing to do. A hydrogen peroxide might work, but I usually just clean these with alcohol in a cotton swab and then put them on my shelf for the next time I use them. So I think I'm going to work on this plant right here. I'm not sure what this plant is. I'm going to have to look at my map, but I'm just going to do a general pruning on this. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. Down here you can see this is the main stem, and this is a sucker that has grown off the main stem but has basically turned into a main stem. Now normally when I'm pruning tomatoes, I keep all of this pruned off as it's growing. So I have one main stem for about 2 feet, because what's going to happen is I'm going to have a cattle panel here about 2 feet up on that T-post, and I really don't want any branches or anything below that 2 foot mark. But these are all about 2 feet tall right now, so clearly I'm not going to prune it that extreme, but I do want to start getting off some of this growth off this main stem without stressing it too much. So I'm going to leave this main big one here for now. I am going to cut off this branch right here. Now that seems extreme. That's a nice big branch. And actually I could take this inside, put it in water, and it'll propagate roots from the end there. So if I wanted to grow another tomato plant from this, I could. I'm not going to do that because I don't need any more tomato plants. But you could take off these branches, stick that stem in some water, and it'll make some roots, and you can plant it in the ground later on. Okay, so I'm looking in here. This already looks a little bit cleaner. I'm really going to just focus on these smaller branches right now. So I've got a sucker here and a branch here, and a sucker here and a branch here. So I think I'm going to cut this off right here. I want to start making sure I've got airflow at the bottom. This branch doesn't look that healthy, so I'm going to cut it off. I'm going to cut this one off, and I'm going to think about this sucker. I'm not going to do it today. I'm going to cut this branch off this sucker that's sort of like a secondary stem here, or secondary main stem. I'm just going to clear anything off that's touching the ground, because those are going to be the leaves that are going to succumb to disease a lot faster, or the ones that are on the ground, especially if it rains. So I'm going to cut off this branch right here. There we go, nice clean cut. I've got a cat that is rubbing on me while I'm trying to do this, so the camera is being a little wonky. Cut that one off. Already you can see how this is really opening this up and allowing there to be airflow here at the bottom of this plant. There's one more branch over here I'm gonna cut off. The other thing I'm gonna do with this plant is I'm really gonna try to get a lot of these suckers that are growing out taken off, because I don't really need all this extra growth in here right now. So I've taken out a bunch of suckers here in these elbows. I still have all these other suckers that have grown that are going to produce a lot of fruit. So I'm not really worried about needing all these extra suckers in here. That is where it's going to make this plant really crazy and hard to manage if I just keep letting all those suckers grow. So I've got a main stem, another stem, that's a sucker here, and another big sucker over here. That's going to be plenty to really get this plant going. And now it looks a lot better. It's a lot cleaner. It's going to have a lot more airflow in here. And at this point, I'll just have to come in here and keep an eye on it. And when it gets a little bit taller, I'll start to trellis this on my cattle panels. Okay, this plant right here is the perfect specimen of a tomato plant. But you see how you have this nice central stalk. You've got your main branches coming off of it. I've allowed one sucker to stay here because this is my Beefmaster tomato plant, so I want these tomatoes to be nice and big, and for the most part I'm going to keep these suckers off until maybe the plant gets a little bit bigger. But see how open that is, how the air can get through, the leaves can all have access to sunshine. This is really what I'm going for in the garden, especially with my bigger tomato plants. As I look at these plants, they really are a hot mess because I let them do their own thing. And that's fine. I've done this long enough that I have a pretty good idea how to get in there and shape them the way I want to shape them and which branches I need to take off. But if you're uncertain, this is what I would say to focus on. Remember 30% of the plant, so just kind of give it a look. If you err on the side of caution, that'd be the better choice on pruning, and you can always come back and prune a few days later after it's had some growth and some time to, restore itself. Aeration, so you're kind of looking at how many branches and suckers you have, and you want to allow there to be airflow. So if you can see through the plant, that's a pretty good indication that you're going to have airflow going through there. And the other thing to consider is how close is it to the next plant. So I've got one here that has 4 suckers growing off the main stem. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at it and just trying to decide which stem I'm going to cut off, which sucker stem I'm going to cut off. I'm going to cut the one off that's growing towards my other tomato plant because I want to give those plants space between them. But you can train those branches to go the direction you want them to go. So keep that in mind. I don't have my trellises up yet, so I'm just trying to do the best I can before I get those trellised. And then the last thing I would say to remember is, of course, what is your goal with that plant? Is your goal bigger fruit or more fruit? Because that's going to help you determine how many of those suckers you really want to trim off. Just know that the more suckers you have, the more fruit you'll have, and the less energy will be put towards making those fruit really big. The less suckers you have, the more your plant will be able to focus its energy on the fruit that it does have. So hopefully that'll help you kind of look at your priorities for the plant and what you're trying to accomplish with it. Okay, now I want to show you the seedlings that have been growing in my house for the last about 3 weeks. I decided to grow some different varieties, a couple that I had thought I had lost, and I'm pretty sure I have at least a couple of those that actually did recover, but having a few extra is not such a bad thing. And then a couple of them I didn't grow. I just chose not to grow this year. So I thought, well, what the heck? They're varieties that grow a lot quicker. So I chose some varieties that I knew would grow fast so that they would be mature by the end of the season. So I have one of my favorite tomato varieties. It's called a silvery fir tree tomato. It's a determinate tomato, which means it has a determined size, a determined amount of fruit. So it will not be the plant that goes crazy and grows over the top of your trellis. It will actually, it's a much smaller plant. You don't ever want to prune or top off your determinate tomato plants because then you're basically shortening its lifespan. So this is it, my only determinate tomato that I'm growing this year. And the nice thing about it is I don't have to trellis it, so I can fit them in the garden someplace where I have an open space and know that it's not gonna take over. So that's the silvery fir tree. Again, it's one of my favorite varieties to grow. I started a cosmic eclipse. It's a really cool saladette, so like 2 to 4 ounce tomato. And so just like the name insinuates, it looks like something from the outer galaxies. I know that it'll ripen by the time the end of the season gets here. So cosmic eclipse. And the other variety I wanted to try this year was called a Tigerella. Like an orange and red striped tomato. It's really cool, just like the name, like a tiger. And it's supposed to be a really quick to mature variety, so I decided I would give this one a try, and I have not tried this one before, so this will be a fun treat to try this year. And then what was the other one I did? Oh, Napa Chardonnay. Napa Chardonnays are my absolute favorite cherry tomato, other than Sun Gold and Mexico Midgets. So I wanted to make Mexico Midget. I wanted to make sure that I had some Napa Chardonnays, so I grew some of those, as well as some Mammoth basil, because a lot of my basil got wiped out in the cold snap. Although it's really trying to come back over here, I wanted to make sure I had enough basil. So right here on my right, I have some basil growing. So see, you can recover. If you have failure in the garden, there's always a way to figure out how to get that crop you really want, or to, you know, try something different the next year. So I've been very, very pleasantly surprised how these plants have pulled through, how I've been able to start them from seed, and I'm gonna have a really great tomato harvest this year, even though I thought I lost everything just 3 weeks ago. So some people ask me how in the world I'm able to have 5 children, a family, a business, and maintain a garden like this. But it's really just doing small steps at a time, a little bit at a time, over a week, over a month, allows me to have a handle on this garden. So we're always out here looking, we're always out here pruning. Every time I'm in the garden, I'm pulling up weeds, maybe not all of them, but maybe I'll just focus on a certain section that day. So it's just a little bit at a time, allows me to really keep this garden manageable and obviously healthy. That's the goal, right? Healthy with all the fruit that we're trying to grow in it. So I hope this video was helpful for you. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Share this with someone you think it might be helpful to, and consider subscribing. And as always, my name is Landon Gilfillan here at Pepper and Pine Garden Design, growing gardeners and their gardens. And I'll see you in the next video.